Welcome, my name is Kayla Lumbra, and today we are going to be discussing the exploitation and vulnerabilities of migrant farm workers, as well as looking into one of America's most lethal serial killers who targeted this minority. Juan killed 25 migrant workers in the 1970s and was at the time of his conviction in 1973 America's worst serial killer until the conviction of John Wayne Gacy Jr. in 1980. To begin our discussion today, we are going to start off by talking about migrant workers and the difficulties they face. The following is a quote from Cesar Chavez, a prominent labor leader and union organizer who founded the National Farm Workers Association. Farm workers are involved in the planting and the cultivation and the harvesting of the greatest abundance of food known in the society. They bring in so much food to feed you and me and the whole country, and enough food to export to other places. The ironic thing and the tragic thing is that they make this tremendous contribution. They don't have enough money or food left to feed themselves. Migrant workers in the 1970s and still today do not have the same privileges as others in the United States. They do not have regular homes, schooling, or even the privilege to bathe regularly. In the United States, 90% of migrant children are Latino origin, which means there are language barriers between both the students and the parents and the teachers, which can make it harder for migrant children than the average student. According to the National Agricultural Workers Survey, 18% of farm workers speak English, 81% speak Spanish, and 2% speak other languages such as Creole. Additionally, because the nature of being a migrant worker is to move constantly, those children who move from state to state are put at a further disadvantage because not all schools teach topics at the same time. While one school can be teaching algebra, another one could be teaching calculus. Child labor laws do not protect children working in agriculture as they do other sectors of child labor. 70% of working children in the United States work in agriculture. A report from the Association of Farm Worker Opportunity Programs, AFOP for short, found that children work in the fields for 30 hours per week on average, often during the school year. Since 1938, the federal labor laws have excluded children that work in agriculture from the protections that other working children have. As long as a child is over the age of 12 and has their parents' permission to work on a farm, there is no restriction as to when they can work except for during school hours. The National Farm Worker Ministry, NFWM for short, has estimated that there are 500,000 children under the age of 18 working on farms across the United States. The NFWM also stated that in 2002, over 70% of all injuries related to tractors and vehicles in the fields occurred while children were operating the machines. The problems migrant children face create a systemic issue amongst the migrant farming community because the children are put at a disadvantage or not given the opportunities that other children have. Many migrant children drop out of school before graduating or getting their GED, leaving them with minimal options for work in their future. According to the NFWM, the average highest grade of school completed amongst farm workers is 7th grade. Additionally, only 10% of migrant farm workers finish high school, and 80% of adult migrant farm workers function at or below the 5th grade level. This is partially due to the lack of educational opportunities in their countries of origin. The following is a quote from an NPR interview conducted in 2010 by Felix Contreras with his father Luis Contreras, inquiring about his life growing up as a migrant child working on farms in the 1930s and 40s. Because we were migrants, our schooling was incomplete. We would arrive in a town after the school year started and leave before the school year was over. We didn't always have the basic necessities of life, like being able to take a bath regularly. Because we often had to set up our tent in the countryside, we ate a lot of what we found growing in the wild, fruits and some vegetables. Luis Contreras was fortunate to graduate high school. In his graduating class of 300 students in 1948, only 5 of which were Mexican. Luis was lucky to break the cycle, unlike many other migrant workers who were not able to. Moving forward in history, the Delano grape strike had a major impact on the rights of migrant workers. September 8, 1965, members of the Agricultural Workers Organizing Committee walked out on strike against Delano Table and Wine grape growers. The workers were protesting for unions after years of poor pay and working conditions. The strike, led by Cesar Chavez, the leader of the National Farm Workers Association, carried on for about 5 years and led to a 300-mile march from Delano, California to Sacramento, California. The Delano grape strike spread across the nation and transformed into a boycott amongst both lower and middle-class communities. In 1970, the first union contracts began to be signed. The unification of the middle-class families boycotting grapes with the lower-class farm workers finally led to the beginning of rights for farm workers. Today in the United States, based on the U.S. Department of Labor's most current National Agricultural Workers Survey, the average total income of farm workers is between $15,000 to $17,499 a year for individuals and $20,000 to $24,999 for a family. Farm worker family incomes have not increased since 2009. This total also includes income that some farm workers receive from outside of farming. The current federal poverty level for a family of 3 is $19,790. 25% of all farm workers had a family income below the federal poverty line. Oftentimes, farm workers are paid based on their productivity. This is referred to as piece rate, which incentivizes them against taking breaks. According to the NFMW, it's possible for a farm worker being paid by piece rate to make less than the minimum wage. For instance, the piece rate for sweet potatoes in North Carolina averages 45 cents per 35-pound bucket. The average productivity for a worker is about 15 buckets per hour, which means during an 8-hour workday, a worker will produce 120 buckets of sweet potatoes, or 4,375 pounds of sweet potatoes. According to the 45-cent piece rate, a worker would receive only $6.75 an hour, which is less than North Carolina's $7.25 an hour minimum wage. There was a law created in an attempt to solve this problem in 1966. The Fair Labor Standards Act requires employers on large farms to pay minimum wage if a worker doesn't earn it based on the piece rate. But there are loopholes to the system. About 1/3 of the nation's farm workers work on small farms, and these are not subjected to federal law surrounding minimum wage. Now that we have begun to discuss the vulnerabilities of migrant workers over the years, we're going to talk about Juan Corona, a man who was once a migrant farm worker who immigrated from Mexico and rose up in the rankings to exploit and kill other migrant workers. Juan Vallejo Corona was born February 7, 1934, in Mexico. In 1950, when he was 16, he immigrated from Mexico to Imperial Valley, California, following his brothers. He started working in America on a farm picking carrots and melons, and eventually moved to Yuba City, California, and began working as a ranch worker in May 1953. In 1953, Juan also met and married his first wife, Reno, and everything in Juan's life seemed to be going all right. In December 1955, Sutter County floods occurred December 24, 1955, after 2 weeks of heavy rainfall. Yuba City was at the joining of the Yuba and Feather River. The only thing stopping the city from flooding during sizable storms were strategically placed levees. The Gumtree Levee on the Feather River bursted open and unleashed a 21-foot-tall wall of water on Yuba City Christmas Eve night. In Yuba City, 40,000 residents evacuated successfully. 600 citizens were rescued by boat or helicopter, and 38 people were killed by the floodwater. Yuba City was under approximately 8 feet of water after the levee burst. The storm death total in the surrounding communities was 74 deaths and resulted in $200 million worth in economic losses. The communities affected were able to rebuild, and today's Yuba City population is more than 65,000 people. But at the time, the devastating natural disaster had a major effect on Juan Corona. The Sutter County flood triggered Corona to have a psychotic break. He believed after these floods that everyone had died in the flood and that he was living in a ghost town. During January 1956, Corona was admitted to DeWitt State Hospital in Auburn, California, as a result where he was diagnosed as a paranoid schizophrenic. During his time at DeWitt State Hospital, Corona received 23 shock treatments without anesthesia over a period of 3 months at the facility, and he was proclaimed recovered, then deported back to Mexico. During later that same year, in 1956, he returned to the United States legally with a green card. In 1960, Corona married his second wife, Gloria Morena, who changed her name to Gloria Corona, and had his first daughter, Martha. In 1966, Juan obtained his first contract for the Sullivan Ranch, where he would provide farmhand labor, and then in the fall of 1969, he was contracted to provide labor to pick olives at the Johnson Ranch. In March 1970, Corona was once again admitted to DeWitt State Hospital for psychological issues. March 1971, he applied for welfare due to the lack of farm work, but was denied due to his assets. He owned 2 homes in addition to having some money in his bank account. May 19, 1971, Goro Kagihiro, a Japanese fruit farmer that Corona supplied workers to, discovered a large hole about 7 foot long by 3.5 foot deep on his peach orchard. The next day, on May 20th, 1971, the farmer discovered that the hole had been filled and called the police, who uncovered the body of migrant worker Kenneth Whitaker, the first of Juan Corona's victims uncovered. Whitaker's body was sexually assaulted, stabbed to death, and hit in the back of the head with a machete. May 25th, 1971, 9 more bodies were uncovered at a nearby orchard, with meat receipts signed by Juan Corona in one of their pockets, and a Bank of America receipt with Corona's name and address on it in another victim's pocket. May 26, 1971, 3 more victims were uncovered at the Sullivan Ranch, where Corona also supplied the workers. May 27, 1971, in the early hours of the morning, police arrived at Corona's Yuba City home with a search warrant and arrested him. At Corona's home, they found evidence suggesting his guilt and seized it. They uncovered 2 bloodstained knives, a machete, and a pistol, and bloodstained clothing. In his home, they also discovered a work ledger that contained 34 names and dates, including 7 of the known victims. The ledger came to be referred to as the death list by the prosecution, who alleged it recorded the dates the men were murdered. The same day Corona was taken into custody, 10 more victims were uncovered. On June 2, 1971, the final 2 known victims were found. All of Corona's 25 known victims were killed over the course of 6 weeks. They were vulnerable male migrant workers he had hired or had been seen with previously. Corona had been supplying the workforce for the orchards where the victims had been found, as well as housing most of them in a barracks-like building on the Sullivan Ranch, where several of the bodies were found. 4 of Corona's victims still remain unidentified because of their transient nature and lack of people searching for them. With the exception of 1 victim who was shot, they were all hit over the head with a machete or knife. Corona was extremely careless. He did not attempt to dispose of murder weapons and would leave holes he planned to bury victims in open for days. Juan Corona was able to get away with these murders for 6 weeks despite his lack of discreetness with the crimes. The trial against Corona began on September 11, 1972, at the Fairfield, California courthouse, more than 60 miles from Yuba City. The jury selection took several weeks, and the trial took another 3 months. Corona was found guilty on 25 counts of murder in 1973 after 45 hours of deliberation, and was sentenced by Judge Richard Patton to 25 terms of life imprisonment to run consecutively without the possibility of parole. At his time of conviction, Corona was America's worst serial killer until John Wayne Gacy Jr. was convicted in 1980 in Chicago. During Corona's time in prison on December 6, 1973, he was stabbed 32 times in his cell because he had bumped into a fellow inmate in a corridor and failed to say "excuse me." He ultimately ended up recovering, and his second wife, Gloria, filed for divorce in January 1974, and it was granted in July of that year. His conviction was later overturned by an appeals court in 1978 on the terms that his attorney did not use insanity as a defense because of his schizophrenia, as well as ruling he had received incompetent representation from his attorney, who called no rebuttal witnesses to the state's 119 prosecution witnesses. A second trial was then held in 1982 with the same outcome. He was convicted on 25 counts of murder. Throughout his time in prison, Corona was denied parole 8 times, the last time being in 2016. Corona died in prison March 4th, 2019, at the age of 85.